welcome. My name's Cammett. I'm a sociologist here at UCLA. You're here for a talk by Professor Melanie Cammett, I hope. I just want to introduce her and also thank the sponsors of today's noon talk. This is a talk sponsored by the Center for Near Eastern Studies here right across the hall in Bunch. And if you're a graduate student or even an undergraduate, Melanie will be in the CNES offices tomorrow at noon for a graduate student and undergrad luncheon, professional development talk, kind of, hearing about discussing projects, methods, initiatives, etc. I've known Melanie for a long time. One of the nicest things Melanie ever did was invite me to come sit in on her class at Brown when she used to teach at Brown, and I got to meet Brown students, and she let me, as a graduate student, mind you, go on and on and on about my fieldwork in Iran. And she made me feel like my project was important, so that was a big help for me. Since then, Melanie's done a lot more. She has 2 monographs to her name, as well as an updated version of probably the most popular and probably best political economy textbook on the Middle East, which Melanie co-authored with Isaac Duan. She's involved in many projects on the Middle East, and I think writes in a way and engages in a variety of methods that is of interest not just to political scientists, but also historians and sociologists who engage in long-term field work in these cases, in these places. And actually, Melanie has done that on her own. So today she's going to talk a more overarching talk on researching identity politics and development in the Middle East, which is a precursor to another big project that she's in the middle of with some students. If you are a grad student, I highly encourage you to come tomorrow to the noon talk over across the hall. There will be lunch provided. Okay. So without any further ado, Professor Melanie Cammett from Harvard University.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to be here, and the view is unbelievable. I've told I actually might be looking at a Kardashian home right now. So I was told to speak sort of almost autobiographically about my research trajectory. So it feels a little kind of embarrassing to do that, but I will do that. But along the way, hopefully it's more about the research, and what I want to show is sort of how I got to these topics and get under the hood and sort of share some maybe not ideal research design encounters that I had along the way. Because oftentimes when we finish a research project, it looks like we had everything figured out from the beginning and we just sort of executed a plan, but that is not how many things have come to me. And it sort of depends on the project, but and the methods you're using as well, because in political science, at least, there's this trend towards, if you're doing experimental work, pre-registering your research. So you do lay out a roadmap with very precise things pre-registered and commit to them in advance and confess if you deviate from them publicly and so forth. So I have engaged in a little bit of that more recently in the last few years, and it's a very different style of doing research and sort of approach to doing research than many of my other projects. So I thought I'd just give a sort of overview of not just what these projects are, but sort of how I got to them and how I thought of them, because sometimes I think it's interesting to hear about how people come up with the questions that they're interested in, and then how I chose some of the methods. And I should say that I'm a very eclectic person when it comes to topics and methods, and I am interested in many different approaches. So if it's something I haven't done already, I'll try to learn about it and collaborate with people that are more expert in the particular approach. And so for me, it's been a fun journey along the way to get exposed to different questions and approaches to studying them. So I just want to focus on a number of research themes, starting with the politics of development, political economy work. And I thought maybe I'll only touch on that very briefly because, and I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested in Q&A or if anyone's coming tomorrow and wants to talk more about that. But really what I want to focus on is a series of projects that are largely clustered around identity and development, identity and welfare. And so I'll focus more on that, which stemming from work that I did for a book that came out like 5 years ago, and that has led to a bunch of subsequent research projects. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that started off in this vein for me, the work on non-state social welfare in this book, Compassionate Communalism. And then I want to talk about some areas that I've gone into as a result of the field work that I undertook for that book project. And I would say, broadly speaking, these projects I have going center on some aspect of how sectarianism manifests in everyday life. And so I'll talk about a project that relates to access to social services. And later on in the day, I'm going to be speaking at this colloquium on one of the papers that's coming out of that project. And then I'll talk a little bit about some projects that relate to intergroup relations and public goods provision, and then another cluster of projects related to religion and political behavior. And then finally, I think I have, like 45 minutes or something, so maybe I'll skip over some of this. But and then I'll talk a little bit about some stuff I'm in the very early stages of thinking about right now for a next book project. So you can see how the idea came about and how half-baked it is right now. Hopefully it won't be like that in several years or less. So let me just briefly talk about this line of stuff and then move on because it might be of interest to some people. So Kevin mentioned that I did this updated book with a co-author, Ishat Diwan, that I have some ongoing other work with. And this is probably some of you have heard of the Richards and Waterbury text, A Political Economy of the Middle East, but this was sort of like the Bible when I was in graduate school of, sort of knowing sort of basic features of the political economy of the entire region. So we got offered to take over this book, and it is, in some ways it is a textbook, but it's also a book. It's sort of this weird hybrid thing, and so we had the opportunity to develop it in a different direction. And we tried to sort of build more of a framework in this book, and so we focused on several core themes in the updated version, and now we're actually supposed to be doing another version, which I keep putting off, but eventually we'll have to do that. But we tried to sort of lay out a framework that presents the region as varieties of political economies with at least 3 different clusters, actually 4 in the region, and then talked about the various ways that social contracts developed in these different political economies, how fiscal crises have manifested across the whole region, but in different ways in these different political economies, and then focus on this very important issue of crony capitalism. I know you've contributed to some of the work that Ishat has ongoing with that theme. But just to mention that this, working on this thing gave rise to a number of questions for me that I've been pursuing in one way or another. First of all, when we had some figures in one of the opening chapters in this book that looked at things like growth rates comparatively cross-regionally over time, and that actually when you look in cross-regional comparative perspective, the Middle East is not that underdeveloped. I'm not saying it's a panacea of beauty and development and equity and so forth, not at all. We know that, and there's a lot of interesting research coming out of by economists now looking at how vastly undermeasured inequality is, for example, in the Middle East. But there's this, the reason why this was interesting to me is there is a narrative out there in some of the long-term historical work in economics and political science on the Middle East that it's a total basket case. And a lot of it juxtaposes the Middle East to Europe and Western Europe and gives a lot of long-term historical reasons, whether it's Islamic institutions or patterns of state-society relations, that developed in the Muslim world. And so reading this work, you think the Middle East is particularly underdeveloped, but it's actually not by some measures. And so I thought this was interesting and worthy of exploration. I'm not doing any active projects that look cross-regionally at this. I mean, I do think this is work that somebody should be doing more, but I did write a sort of big essay about this that touched off some thinking. What I have been doing more is with Ishat Diwan, we're working on this never-ending paper looking at varieties of rule of law in the Middle East. Hopefully we're close to completion and sending this thing out. Because there is interesting variation there, and when you adopt a very sort of narrow definition of the rule of law around commercial transactions, there's some interesting variation in countries across the region, with some respecting commercial transactions more than others. So we're doing a little bit of work on that. And then I've also been interested in sort of intra-regional variation about why is it that welfare regimes develop differently within this region. There is some very interesting work on this that's coming out right now in a book by Ferdinand Eibel. I think he's at King's College in the UK. But he's looking really in the post-colonial period. But I'm working on this project with a number of graduate students and postdocs that is an effort to digitize data from the colonial period through the present for 18 countries in the region. And we are eventually going to make this public. We're calling it the MINAHDA project, the Middle East North Africa Historical Data Archive. You get the pun with Nahda. So that's, we've been putting together this data set. We're working with the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard to create a platform that's going to make it publicly available and interactive, so people can download and upload and so forth. But of course, we want to do something with this data first. So we're working on a couple of papers right now, looking at questions like, why do you see more social spending in some places rather than others? And looking at the relative effects of colonial legacies versus post-colonial legacies, because at least among political scientists, I think we haven't paid that much attention to colonial legacies. I know economic historians have, and my late wonderful colleague Roger Owen was one of the big players in this. But we as political scientists have not looked so much for the Middle East, North Africa region at colonial legacies, and looking at the degree to which colonial legacies persist or actually break down in the post-colonial period. So that's sort of what we're looking at in a variety of papers there. But I'm going to actually leave this aside because I do find this stuff interesting, but I've been more running in this other direction that stems from the work that I did on this book that came out in 2014. And I think it's worth just saying how I got onto this, because for anyone who's, it's interesting to think about where do these questions come from. So I got interested in this phenomenon of religious or ethnic actors providing social welfare right after the US invaded Iraq. There was this newspaper article in the New York Times, and back then we were still reading paper copies and opening up and reading. If you really wanted to read the article, you had to open it up and read to the end. And so I read this entire article, including inside the paper, and there was this one paragraph in there about, and the article was about all these new parties that popped up in the wake of the US invasion, that there were scores, if not more, parties that had popped up out of the woodwork and suddenly formed. Many of them were religious parties, like the Shia such and such party or whatever. And one of these Shia parties had a flag, and it went to a health center in Baghdad and planted the flag on it and said, "This is now the Shia such and such party health center." I thought, this is a crazy phenomenon. This is a country that had a pretty centralized public welfare system, not necessarily a good one especially after sanctions and so forth and war, but it was a largely predominantly public welfare system, and all of a sudden all these parties are popping up, and some of them are claiming pieces of the state and putting their flags on it. And I started thinking, that is a crazy phenomenon. Imagine being a family living in Baghdad in this, this invasion, the state is toppling, you have to figure out where am I going to go take my kid who has a fever, and then you show up and there's now a Shia political party running your health center. What does that mean for people? So that's sort of what got me thinking about it. But this project eventually ended up with this question of, why is it that some sectarian organizations reach out across communal lines and deliver more broadly to people from other communities or people that aren't that active supporters, and why are some of them more focused on delivering to their own communities, which is sort of the default assumption. And I'm not going to get into what I argued and all that stuff here, but I just want to say that I didn't arrive at this question from the moment that I read that New York Times article. This is a case of what soaking and poking. So multiple research trips, tons of interviews, feeling out. I spent a month in 2004 in Lebanon talking to different groups. And the reason why it ended up being Lebanon is originally I was going to do this work in Iraq, and I had actually been talking to Anthony Shadid, who was then the Washington Post Middle East correspondent, and he said, well, come stay in the Washington Post house and you can start working on this. And then things heated up with the war in Iraq, and it just seemed like it was not a practical thing to do, to go do field work in Iraq at that time. So, but lo and behold, there was all the very similar stuff going on in Lebanon, albeit coming out of a different historical context and so forth. And in fact, there was this phrase going around in the mid to late 2000s in Iraq, in Arabic, the Lebanonization of Iraq. So people were talking about how Iraq was sort of looking more and more like Lebanon, and in this respect, that was certainly true, where you had more religious actors popping up as parties and also as welfare providers, among other things. So that's how I got to that, is just, many interviews back and forth, trying to figure out sort of what was there were many questions that came out of my head about this, like what's the effect of getting your welfare from a religious provider on your political behavior and all sorts of things like that. But for a variety of reasons, I ended up focusing more on this question. And I just to say a little bit about data and methods, this was also a work in progress. I would be lying if I said to you, oh, I had the research design figured out from the beginning. Basically, I started off by doing tons of interviews. I did all the elite interviews myself, and then worked with a team of graduate students in Lebanon who interviewed people from their own communities. And it's not that they all were sectarians who identified themselves as Sunni or Shia or whatever, but it just made a lot more sense to have people from the same community interviewing people for a variety of reasons that are probably self-evident to you. And so that started making me think a lot about how to narrow this down. I spent a lot of time just hanging out in health centers and schools and hospitals and pedagogical training institutes run by all of the actors. So the book is about Hezbollah, the Future Movement, the ML Movement, 3 different Christian parties. And I certainly was in all of their institutions, such as they had them. But I also visited a lot of religious charities and NGOs that didn't have affiliations. And so that started making me think of other questions along the way, and was really informative also about, what the political parties were doing. And then I, also started looking more at the materials that these parties were producing, not just in the contemporary period, but over time. So there were some really interesting publications dating back decades especially by the Christian parties, but also by Hezbollah, that sort of detailed their welfare activities, where they were opening up centers, the kinds of community contacts they had. So there were some very interesting sort of archival materials, I don't know if we can call them that, that also were helpful. But then I started thinking, well, I'm getting a picture of what's going on here from all these interviews, but nobody's going to believe me if I just tell you, even with 175 interviews, that this is what's going on. How do I make an argument that seems to apply more generally and that seems slightly more convincing? And so that's when I started thinking about this spatial component. So that one of the chapters in the project is basically looks at correlations between where these parties establish their programs and what the communities look like, particularly in terms of sectarian demography. Like, are they targeting places that are populated by exclusively their own people? Are they targeting mixed areas? And so that became interesting to me. And I came to that idea not because I was having some deductive insight into this, but because in these interviews over and over and over again, people kept telling me, just look at where they put their facilities. This is meaningful. And this is not just meaningful in terms of the priorities of the parties, but this is how citizens and other actors were interpreting the actions of these groups. So I came to this approach through interviews. That's what gave me the idea. And fortuitously, at that very moment, Brown University, which is where I was based, had just started a spatial analysis program. So I did like a course in GIS analysis, and so that there was support for this kind of stuff. And then I also did a survey to see if some of the arguments I was making, at least observable implications of them, held in a nationally representative sample. So, it came to me sort of in various waves, not at some immediate sort of initial point in the project. And I think I probably approached my research a little bit differently after doing this, but that's the way this project unfolded for me. But what was, I think, interesting for me also is that it sort of lent itself to a lot of other directions. I mean, doing all this field work, really being there in these institutions and talking to people a lot about this phenomenon got me thinking about a lot of other questions. One of them was culminated in an edited volume I did with Lauren Morris McLean on the politics of non-state social welfare, because we started thinking more broadly, given the work that each of us do on different types of non-state providers of welfare, that there's some larger questions here. So we worked on an edited volume there that brought together a bunch of people working in places all over the world. But it also started making me think, about other questions. So one of them was, all these people, when I was visiting these centers or talking to people about the welfare programs of Hezbollah or whatever, kept saying, Hezbollah is much better at doing this than others. That's why they have so much support. But these are completely unsubstantiated claims. They're just sort of thrown out there by people who love Hezbollah and people who hate Hezbollah. If you love them, you say, oh, they're so good. And people who hate them say, oh, they're, this is just how they buy support. So I kept hearing that over and over again. And then we know that Hamas was doing this and other organizations. So I started thinking, well, is there something to this? Because we often hear about, like, essentially the party discipline of these groups. And are they particularly organized? And, do they have better grassroots penetration? And some people have been doing some really interesting work on this, like Stephen Brooks' recent book. And so maybe that translates literally into better welfare delivery, right? Because there's certain features of an organization's capacity that enables it to provide services better. So I started thinking about this question about, and more broadly, people were saying that Islamists have advantages in the political sphere. So I did a sort of review essay with an analytical framework on this with Pauline Jones-Luong at Michigan, where we started thinking through some of these ideas. And one of the ideas in there what also was related to how welfare might translate into better respect for these organizations, their popular appeal, and so forth. But then I started thinking, we don't actually know how well these groups are supplying it. This is supplying welfare goods. This is a question I entirely sidestepped in the book that I did. I didn't attempt to assess this whatsoever. So I ended up getting this Mellon Foundation Fellowship to go spend a year at the Harvard School of Public Health studying public health, taking classes in certain aspects of public health and research methods and so forth. And I developed this project, and it was supporting this project to look at the quality of primary health care. And initially it was pitched in terms of Islamists providing healthcare. Do they supply better healthcare than others? And I was going to again do work in Lebanon, but it became a broader project. So that's part of the project on access to social welfare I want to talk about a little bit. And then if we have time, I'll talk about some of the other stuff. But arguably this is an important feature of people's lives in places where sect is very politicized and where these groups are involved in either providing the benefits or brokering access to them. This is sort of a manifestation of sectarianism in everyday life. And then just the last thing that the book that I wrote in 2014 sort of started me on was thinking about the phenomenon of sectarianization. And initially I was thinking, let me write a book about sectarianization. And there's been some really interesting work. Some of you might be familiar with that edited volume that came out a couple years ago by Hashemi and Postel, I think, called Sectarianization. And so after I read that, I was like, I don't need to write this book. I think we know this already. And there's been a lot of really great work on how ethnic identity gets politicized, right? So I don't think I had much to add there. But then I started thinking we actually don't know a lot about how this stuff comes down once it gets politicized. So time permitting, I want to talk about that at the end. But this all came out of doing this project on the ground in Lebanon, and then having repeat visits over time. And actually in real time, it's almost like a slow motion camera, I literally witnessed sect become politicized in Lebanon between 2004 and the present. Because it was not, the politics of sect, even in sectarian power sharing Lebanon, was not so politicized as it became after 2005 with Hariri's assassination, after 2008, after the Syria war and so forth. So I have literally watched, interpersonal relations between people who have been friends for 25 years break apart over sect. And so it's been this really bizarre sort of slow motion observation of sectarianization in the same place over time. And then so that got me interested in this question, like how do you bring it down? So let me just talk a little bit about a couple of these projects. I'm aware I don't have time to go into all the detail I have here. But I mentioned I had this fellowship to go spend the year studying certain aspects of public health. So a colleague of mine at Brown connected me with this economist at the World Bank, Jishnu Das, who's done all this interesting work on measuring the quality of health and education, initially in India, but then in all kinds of other places. And he developed a set of tools with his collaborators to systematically measure quality. And so I started, really digging into the stuff that they were doing and learning more about this and talking to people at the School of Public Health about how different people measure quality, because I started thinking, well, we make all these claims about how these actors provide social goods, but we know nothing about how well they actually do it. So why don't we go in and measure this? And also, what are the implications for everyday people? Like, how are people accessing services when they are supplied by actors that are not the state, which, however flawed the state might be in many places, at least in theory has a mandate to serve all, has a public mandate, whereas many of these actors are not constrained by that. There's nobody saying they have to. There might be social norms that make them pretend that they are or even make them do it, but they are not constrained in the same sort of legal formal way as the state. So one thing that I started thinking about was, is there something about the mission of these organizations that affects the quality of care? And I ran a pilot study for this project in Greater Beirut in 2014 or 15 that culminated in one paper that I published with my co-author in World Development a couple years ago, in which we looked at this question. And we don't pretend that we've nailed it and we can tell you absolutely this is, we don't have like perfect causal claims here, evidence here. But we found some evidence that actually the mission of the organization does affect the quality of care, because different providers doctors select into working in these places. They're not required, it's not like some, public requirement to serve in these places. So there's choice about where they go. So it's possible that different places attract better doctors. And it might be because some doctors that are better are more attracted to the mission of one than the other. And so initially we were thinking, well, all this stuff on Islamist social service provision that's out there, most likely it's those types or the religious actors that are going to recruit the best people. Because those are the people that are going to be completely mission driven. And there's some work on the economics of religion that suggests this might be the case in the US context and so forth. So we went in and we looked, and it actually, in that study, it looks like the non-sectarian, non-religious actors were getting the best doctors who were exerting themselves the most to treat patients. And if you know the Lebanese political context, this actually makes sense. So we started interviewing some of these doctors and people that run organizations. And the thing is, in the Lebanese political context, sectarian groups and many times religious actors are linked to sectarian parties or perceived to be linked to them, are viewed as corrupt. If you look at public opinion surveys, people think that these are corrupt actors, that it's a big racket, it's all patronage based, and there's a lot to support those perceptions, and that it's all just sort of So what this implies is that perhaps those doctors that select to work for the non-sectarian, non-religious groups are the ones that are actually the most sort of altruistically minded, professionally minded doctors, because they can't get anything back from those groups. They have no resources. They do not have a piece of the state the way religious actors do, sectarian actors do. So there's no return if you're going to go volunteer for a secular NGO in Lebanon. And I'm talking about domestic secular NGOs. So none of these are internationals. And so our argument was that people select into these different types of doctors select into working in these places, and that the ones that work in the secular NGOs are the ones that are the most concerned about treating the patients and not expecting anything in return and so forth. And what's interesting is Stephen Brooke, who's done work on Islamist social service provision in Egypt, found the opposite before the revolution. And that makes sense too. And so we had an argument in there about how this is bound by political context. So in the Egyptian context, pre-revolution, pre-Morsi, Islamic groups looked wonderful compared to the state, which is the secular state that was viewed as corrupt and so forth. And so he ran this survey asking people about which organization, for example, provides better health care. I think he might have published this in Perspectives on Politics. And people uniformly reported that these fictional Islamic NGOs provided the best quality of care for healthcare. And it's, because they view them as more pure, less corrupt, more committed to the service and so forth. In that context, that makes sense. It's sort of the flip side of the Lebanese context where religion was associated with patronage and corruption and so forth. So that was one area where we started going with it, and we did a scale up of this study a year and a half ago where we did a nationally representative study. And so one of the things we want to do, this is the last paper to be written, is kind of revisit this hypothesis, and we have more rigorous ways to test whether mission is driving selection into these health centers through a conjoint experiment. And so we have been working on a couple of other papers out of this. One of them has to do with sort of where people that we're revising pretty heavily right now, where people sort of in-group versus out-group social service, access to social services. So when people go to a provider not from their own religious community, do they get the same quality of care? And so the two sort of empirical things that paper is structured around is, one, where do people select into? And we show overwhelmingly that people select into their own communities to seek care. but that in some cases people do go to out-group communities. So we interrogate the reasons why people go to in-group versus out-group, and then we show that there is a mismatch in the quality of care that people receive, depending on whether they go to one from their own community versus one from the out-group. That one, you know, we can't show it quite as rigorously as we'd like, because we were not able to randomly assign people to go to health centers for ethical and logistical reasons. But you know, we do the best that we can with the data at hand. And then we have another paper that I'm going to talk about later today, which is about the quality of care that Syrians versus Lebanese nationals receive in these centers. And we find that they actually receive equal care, despite the fact that we document prejudice by doctors against Syrians through multiple methods, and we have an argument about why that's the case. So that's been one project coming out of this that sort of struck me as a result of hanging out in all of these centers. This is just a figure from that project that shows where people are selecting into. So you can see this is a Sankey diagram that shows sort of flows. And so on the left, these are people, patients, and these are centers. And you can see the thick lines are indicating that people tend to go to their own communities. So for example, this is Sunni people, and this is a Sunni center. So people tend to select into their own, but you have some weird things with like lots of Sunnis going to Christian centers and so forth. So we're looking into that as well. I'm just rushing through all of this. So I mean, more broadly, you know, my work is primarily on the Middle East and North Africa, and I feel more comfortable working there, being that I speak the languages, and you know, and know a lot about history and context of the whole region. Earlier in my dissertation was on Morocco and Tunisia, and so I've spent a lot of time in North Africa as well, and a lot of time in Jordan and other places. So I feel pretty comfortable across the whole region, generally speaking. But I've been thinking about extensions to some of the projects I'm doing in other places, and so some of the work I'm doing is now in Brazil, and then I'm also been doing some work in India, and this is a project that looked again at that also looks at sort of intergroup dynamics and public goods welfare, so to speak, and so maybe I'll just briefly mention this because it did come out of all of this thinking from that earlier project. And I should say that there was a tiny little bit on India at the end of my book. And I also, for whatever reason, seem to be on tons of dissertation committee and book conferences for people that work on India, which is great. So I've learned a ton about India through the years. I feel like I've been vicariously studying India for a long time. And so it didn't seem that crazy for me to go do work in India. So this is a project that I started thinking about with two collaborators, one of whom is actually from Delhi and works on India and is a professor at Queen's University in Canada, and another is a graduate student in my department. And so we started thinking about not these kinds of welfare goods that get delivered by agencies, you know, like health centers or schools. We started thinking about the stuff that people have to coordinate at the neighborhood level that requires cooperation. And so we did a lot of qualitative work in collaboration with the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, trying to figure out a bunch of things that helped us set up this project. But we wanted to look at the conditions under which people collaborate at the community level to supply some kind of public good. And we were interested first in whether certain accountability mechanisms that we introduced through survey experiment would push people to cooperate more fully around the provision of public goods. And secondly, whether we saw variation in Hindus and Muslims. And we were interested in that variation in Hindus and Muslims because you have a dominant Hindu majority, and now I think it's safe to say a pretty persecuted Muslim minority, particularly in the current political climate. And so we were interested to see if there were different responses across communities to these accountability mechanisms. So working with the CPR in Delhi, we came up with the idea of working on drain cleanage, and it's truly a horrific problem, and it's a good public good, in quotes, for us to work on, because it really does require collaboration in order to keep drains clean. So it's a huge problem in slum communities. You have these gullies that run through slum communities, and all kinds of disgusting stuff that I'm not going to describe runs down them, all kinds of refuse. They smell terribly, and they are literally, these gullies, outside of people's one-room dwellings. And so people have a real interest in cleaning these things. And if you clean yours, it doesn't make a difference if the person upstream doesn't, right? So it requires a lot of coordination, and the state does not take responsibility for what's going on inside the slum. It'll sort of do the periphery, but it won't take responsibility for what's going on inside. So that's what we looked at. And basically, we were looking at whether accountability mechanisms move people, and whether this varies. And so what we found, and we've just presented this paper, and I think we're finalizing it to send out soon, is that Hindus don't really respond so much to the accountability mechanisms, but Muslims do. And we have some arguments about what's going on there, but I think a lot of it has to do with lack of trust in government institutions, but also fear of looking bad when you are a persecuted minority. So a desire to show that you are contributing to the communal good and not attract negative attention to yourself. So we've been trying to look at this with some of the quantitative data that we have, and we can definitely show that trust seems to mediate some of this. And also some of the qualitative data that we had in working with the Center for Policy Research there. And then I think I only have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll skip over this, right?
Depends how many questions you want.
Okay.
If you want none, you should keep talking.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip over this. I've just been doing a lot of work recently on sort of the role that religion plays in political behavior, and also the role of, maybe I'll just say a few words about this. So doing all this work on welfare goods and the politics of distribution, I got sort of interested in clientelism and patronage, and certainly a lot of us who work on the Middle East think that clientelism and patronage is a big deal in the region, and I know this is a big deal in other regions as well. But also because I did all these interviews, and the team of graduate students I was working with did all these interviews, I started to think it's really not as big of a deal as we think it is, and that there's a lot of other stuff going on that political scientists who work on the Middle East are missing, in terms of the micro politics of why people are supporting politicians and so forth. And so two things, the main thing that came to mind for me was fear and sectarian hate speech. Coming right out of the ethnic politics instrumentalist approaches, I started thinking, surely in the context of political violence, in the context of politicians who are using hate speech against outgroups, that's going to affect people's political behavior. So we want to test a bunch of other things, like whether there's an effect of religion, net of these material benefits, and so forth. So that was the logic behind that project. And so we've been working on this and finding that actually clientelism is not the only game in town, and that religion moves people in and of itself, and seems to have an effect on people's propensity to support politicians. But interestingly, we're not finding that much effect of hate speech and fear mongering. And so I have some ideas about why that might be the case. I thought for sure that would be the case based on theory and just talking to people in the street. And at least in our survey, which is based on a conjoint experiment, we're not finding that. And so you could maybe argue it's partly an artifact of the design and so forth. I could get into the details, but I think there's something more going on here. So let me just wrap up by saying, a few words about the half-baked ideas that I have right now. Maybe you guys will have some brilliant insights and you can share them with me, so they'll be slightly more baked. So I have been, teaching Middle East politics and giving lectures on what's going on in Syria and elsewhere for a number of years, and it occurs to me that we, as I said earlier, know a heck of a lot about how the Syrian war, which had nothing or very little to do with sect, became sectarianized. And we could say the same thing about Iraq. We could say the same thing about any thousands of other places, right? But I started to think we just don't know that much about how the stuff comes down. And one thing that people have increasingly recognized is that even if the root cause of a grievance is not religion and sect, it often acquires meaning through the course of a conflict, right? We know this from social psychology and other ways as well. So these categories become meaningful to people, and they're hard to dislodge. And so I started thinking about, what do we know about how this stuff comes down? Because we don't know that much, at least for the Middle East, and I wanted to see what do we know about the rest of the world. So I'm actually teaching a class right now on this. This is a wonderful way to learn things, is to teach things, as you well know. And so from what I found so far, there's very few cases in the world of where things got hyper politicized, resulted in violence, ethnic or religious cleavages that have come down and are at peace. But I would love to know your cases if you have them. I've been reading a lot about early modern Europe and Protestant Catholic divisions, which has been interesting, and we've been reading this in my class, which is where I get the word toleration from, borrowing from a book on early modern Europe by Kaplan, Benjamin Kaplan. And so I've been thinking a little bit about what historians are arguing. My colleague Jamal Kafadar is telling me to read Karen Barkey's book, so historians, Empires of Difference, I think, or Empire of Difference. So there's more historical work I need to read.
She's a sociologist, by the way.
Oh, right. Sorry. Got to keep my disciplinary categories right. Okay, so this is the question I want to look at. Like, why is it that some places become, at least establish what we might call toleration, if not kumbaya, right? Get along after serious violence ostensibly waged along these lines. And there are people that are writing about this, and I think they have lots of valuable contributions. Some of them are sort of long-term historical accounts, like Andreas Wimmer's recent work, sociologist, but I think also political scientist. And there's all this work on institutional approaches, like the Leipard and Horowitz and all this stuff. And then there's a lot of work coming out now based on field experiments that try to introduce manipulations in some communities but not others and see their effects on tolerance. And so I think all of these are really valuable, but they still each one of them, and I don't have time to go into what I think are the shortcomings of each of these approaches. I still think there's questions to be answered, and so I've been thinking, early thoughts about research design, and I've come to the conclusion that it has to be subnational, that there's just too many moving parts to do some kind of cross-national work on this, but maybe subnational in multiple places. So, of course, Lebanon is a great case, especially because the war ended officially in 1990, so enough time has passed. Bosnia-Herzegovina is another case I'm thinking of, and I've done some work there before, and still thinking. But I think I would like to look at, through largely observational data, what it is about communities that underwent violence in the name of, let's say, Sunni Shia or Christian Muslim or whatever the cleavage might be, that some of them are able to sort of reduce it, bring it down, and actually have some measure of tolerance and intergroup reconciliation in these communities after enough time has passed. And I'm working on developing a number of ideas about how you would measure this, how would you know toleration when you see it, and so forth. But it strikes me that that's a question that's worth asking because it's a horrible moment that people are living through. We know a lot about how things got ratcheted up, but it's really, really hard to think about how to bring it down. Especially when we're not looking in terms of centuries of structural factors that change gradually over time, but we're trying to think of more proximate factors that may have contributed to this. So So that's the beginning stages and sort of an overview of this kind of lineage of questions that I've been seizing upon, really because of this New York Times article in 2003. So thank you.